The loneliness of men who win without being loved. David stared at his Forbes 30 Under 30 award, sitting on his mahogany desk, the golden plaque reflecting the city lights from his penthouse window. At 32, he had everything society told him would make him happy. A multi-million-dollar company, international recognition, luxury beyond most people's dreams. Yet as he sat there at 2 a.m., scrolling through congratulatory messages from acquaintances and business contacts, one devastating truth echoed in the silence. Not a single person who messaged him actually knew him. This is the paradox that Friedrich Nietzsche understood better than perhaps any philosopher before or since. The profound isolation that comes with achieving greatness in a world that celebrates your victories but remains indifferent to your soul. Nietzsche called it the loneliness of the exceptional man, and it's destroying successful men across the globe in ways that success culture refuses to acknowledge. You see, Nietzsche recognized that society creates a cruel illusion about achievement. We're told that if we climb high enough, work hard enough, become successful enough, we'll finally earn the love and acceptance we've always craved. But what Nietzsche discovered, and what millions of accomplished men learn too late, is that success often brings the opposite of what we seek. The higher you climb, the more isolated you become. How many of you have achieved something significant only to realize that your victory felt hollow without someone who truly cared to share it? With David's journey to this lonely pinnacle began like so many others, with a childhood that taught him that love was conditional on performance. His parents weren't cruel. They were busy, ambitious professionals who showed affection through approval of achievements rather than acceptance of his authentic self. Every A+ grade brought smiles and praise. Every failure brought disappointment and emotional distance. He learned early that his worth was tied to his ability to excel, to stand out, to be exceptional. This lesson, while motivating, planted the seeds of his future isolation. Because when you believe you must earn love through achievement, you unconsciously develop what Nietzsche called the will to power, not over others, but over yourself, driving yourself to heights that few can reach, but even fewer can understand. By college, David had mastered the art of winning. Top of his class, president of 3 organizations, entrepreneur before graduation. People admired him, sought his advice, wanted to be associated with his success. But admiration, he was beginning to learn, is not love. Respect is not intimacy. And being needed for what you can do is not the same as being valued for who you are. The pattern intensified in his professional life. David built his company with the same relentless drive that had carried him through school. 18-hour days, sacrificed weekends, relationships that withered under the weight of his ambition. He told himself it was temporary, that once he reached his goals, he would have time for connection, for love, for the deeper human experiences that seemed to elude him. But Nietzsche understood something that our achievement-obsessed culture doesn't. Success changes you in ways that make genuine connection increasingly difficult. The very traits that make you exceptional, intense focus, high standards, relentless drive, often make you incompatible with people who haven't walked the same path of sacrifice and single-minded determination. David found himself surrounded by people who wanted something from him, investors who saw dollar signs, employees who needed paychecks, women who were attracted to his status rather than his substance. The more successful he became, the harder it became to distinguish between genuine interest and opportunistic attention. He developed what Nietzsche would recognize as the protective cynicism of the successful, the assumption that everyone has an agenda, that authentic connection is a luxury he couldn't afford. The philosopher wrote extensively about the mask of the solitary, the persona that exceptional individuals develop to navigate a world that demands performance while offering little understanding. David had perfected this mask, becoming whoever others needed him to be in any given situation. The confident CEO in boardrooms, the charming date at social events, the dutiful son at family gatherings. But beneath all these masks, he was losing touch with who he actually was when no one was watching. Have you ever felt like you're successful in everyone else's eyes, but completely lost in your own? The tragic irony that Nietzsche identified is that society's definition of success often requires the sacrifice of the very things that make life meaningful. David had achieved financial freedom, but had become a prisoner of his own achievements. His calendar was booked months in advance, his phone constantly buzzing with urgent matters, his mind always racing toward the next goal, the next milestone, the next victory that would surely bring the fulfillment that had so far eluded him. Relationships had become transactions. Friendships were networking opportunities. Romance was complicated by the constant question of whether someone loved him or his lifestyle. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to view vulnerability as weakness, to see his own need for connection as a distraction from the real work of building his empire. But human beings are not designed for such isolation, regardless of how much success they accumulate. Nietzsche himself struggled with profound loneliness throughout his life, understanding intellectually that his philosophical insights separated him from ordinary human connection while yearning desperately for understanding and authentic companionship. A breaking point came for David during what should have been his greatest triumph. Standing on stage accepting an industry award, looking out at hundreds of people applauding his achievements, he felt more alone than he ever had in his life. The applause felt hollow, the recognition empty, the success that had consumed decades of his life suddenly meaningless without anyone who knew the real cost of achieving it. That night, in his empty penthouse, David confronted the philosophical question that Nietzsche posed throughout his work. What is the point of becoming extraordinary, if extraordinary means being cut off from the ordinary human experiences that give life its meaning? What is the value of winning if winning means losing yourself in the process? Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. To be your own man is a hard business. If you try it, you'll be lonely, often and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." But David was beginning to question whether the price he had paid was worth the privilege he had earned. The philosopher understood that exceptional individuals face a unique form of suffering. The burden of seeing possibilities that others cannot, of carrying visions that others cannot understand, of achieving heights that others cannot reach. This isolation is not accidental, it's inherent to the path of excellence. But Nietzsche also believed that this suffering could be transformed into something meaningful if properly understood and embraced. The first step in David's transformation came when he stopped trying to make others understand his journey and started trying to understand it himself. He began to see his loneliness not as a personal failure, but as an inevitable consequence of choosing a path that few are willing or able to walk. This perspective shift, while initially painful, was ultimately liberating. Nietzsche taught that suffering becomes meaningful when we choose it, when we transform ourselves through it, when we use it as raw material for creating something greater than ourselves. David's loneliness, viewed through this lens, became not evidence of his inadequacy but proof of his authenticity. Evidence that he had refused to compromise his vision for the comfort of belonging to the crowd. But understanding isolation is different from accepting it as permanent. Nietzsche believed in the possibility of what he called profound friendship. Connections between individuals who had both achieved some level of self-mastery and could therefore meet each other as equals rather than seeking to use each other to fill psychological voids. David began to seek out others who had walked similar paths, not just successful people, but people who had paid the price of authenticity, who understood the weight of carrying visions that others couldn't see. He found that these connections, while rare, were infinitely deeper and more satisfying than the superficial relationships that had previously filled his life. He also began to redefine success itself. Instead of measuring his worth by external achievements, he started evaluating his life by internal criteria: authenticity, growth, contribution to something larger than himself. This shift didn't diminish his professional success, but it gave that success context and meaning beyond personal glory. What would you choose if you had to pick between being loved by everyone for a false version of yourself or being truly known by a few people for who you actually are? The philosophical revolution that Nietzsche proposed was not the elimination of suffering, but its transformation. David learned to see his loneliness as the price of authenticity, his isolation as evidence of his refusal to conform to others' expectations, his struggles as the raw material for building something genuinely valuable rather than merely successful. This didn't mean accepting loneliness as permanent or inevitable. Instead, it meant approaching relationships from a position of strength rather than need, seeking connection with people who could appreciate depth rather than just success, building intimacy based on mutual respect for each other's journey rather than mutual need for validation. Nietzsche wrote about the concept of amor fati, love of fate, the ability to embrace everything that has happened to you, including the painful parts, as necessary for becoming who you are meant to be. David learned to love even his loneliness, recognizing it as the price he had paid for refusing to live a conventional life, for insisting on creating something meaningful rather than just something profitable. The transformation was not sudden or complete. David still struggled with isolation, still questioned whether his path was worth the price he had paid for it. But he had developed what Nietzsche called the strength to be alone, the ability to find meaning and purpose in solitude, to be his own best company, to create value from his own internal resources rather than depending on external validation. He began to see his business not just as a vehicle for personal success, but as a platform for creating value for others, for contributing to human flourishing in ways that extended beyond profit margins. This shift in purpose provided the meaning that had been missing from his achievements, the sense of contribution that made his sacrifices feel worthwhile. More importantly, David learned to be selective about his relationships, choosing quality over quantity, depth over breadth. He stopped trying to be understood by everyone and started focusing on being genuinely known by a few people who had earned the right to see behind his masks. The irony that Nietzsche would appreciate is that when David stopped desperately seeking love and acceptance, he became more lovable and acceptable. When he stopped performing for others' approval and started living for his own values, he attracted people who were drawn to his authenticity rather than his success. But perhaps the most important lesson David learned from Nietzsche's philosophy was that loneliness and aloneness are not the same thing. Loneliness is the painful awareness of disconnection, the hunger for understanding that goes unfed. Aloneness is the powerful state of being complete within yourself, of finding companionship in your own thoughts and dreams, of being able to enjoy your own company. The successful man who learns to transform loneliness into meaningful solitude discovers that he has access to resources that those dependent on others for validation can never possess. He can make decisions based on principle rather than popularity, can pursue visions that others don't understand, can create value that transcends immediate approval. Nietzsche believed that the highest form of human existence was what he called self-overcoming, the process of continually transcending your current limitations, of becoming more than you are, of creating yourself rather than accepting yourself as fixed. David's journey from lonely success to meaningful solitude was exactly this kind of self-overcoming. The philosopher understood that exceptional individuals would always face the choice between conforming to others' expectations and accepting the isolation that comes with authenticity. But he also understood that this choice, while difficult, was ultimately liberating. The person who chooses authenticity over approval gains access to possibilities that those who live for others' validation can never reach. David's story represents the possibility that Nietzsche saw for all exceptional individuals, the transformation of necessary suffering into chosen strength, the conversion of involuntary isolation into purposeful solitude, the evolution from winning without being loved to creating value that transcends the need for external validation. This is not a story about giving up on connection or accepting loneliness as permanent. It's a story about finding connection on your own terms, about building relationships based on mutual respect for each other's journey rather than mutual need for validation, about discovering that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. The men who achieve great things will always face the temptation to sacrifice their authenticity for acceptance, to dim their light, so others feel more comfortable, to apologize for their success to avoid the discomfort of standing out. But Nietzsche's philosophy offers a different path, the courage to be fully yourself, regardless of whether others understand or approve. David learned that the goal is not to be loved by everyone, but to be truly known by those who matter, not to avoid isolation, but to transform it into something productive. Not to apologize for his success, but to use it as a platform for creating value that extends beyond himself. The loneliness of the exceptional man is real, but it's not permanent. It's a phase of development, a necessary passage through which those who refuse to live conventional lives must travel. On the other side of this passage lies something that most people never experience: the profound satisfaction of living authentically, of creating something meaningful, of being truly yourself regardless of external circumstances. If this resonates with you, if you felt the isolation that comes with refusing to compromise your vision, don't suffer in silence. Share this with someone who needs to understand that their loneliness is not a bug, but a feature of authentic living. Subscribe to join a community of people committed to living authentically rather than just successfully. Like this video if you believe that genuine connection is worth more than superficial approval. Nietzsche's ultimate message was not about accepting loneliness, but about transcending the need for others' approval to feel complete. The man who learns to be his own best company becomes capable of offering genuine companionship to others. The person who no longer desperately needs love becomes truly lovable. The individual who can stand alone becomes worthy of standing with others. Your success is not the problem. Your achievements are not the enemy of connection. The issue is when we use success as a substitute for authenticity, when we achieve greatness while abandoning ourselves in the process. The solution is learning to succeed while remaining true to who you are, to win while staying connected to your own values and vision. The loneliness you feel is not evidence of your failure. It's proof that you've refused to accept a mediocre life, that you've insisted on something more meaningful than what most people settle for. That loneliness can be transformed into strength, into authenticity, into the foundation for connections that are deeper and more satisfying than anything based on superficial compatibility. You are not alone in feeling alone. Millions of successful people struggle with the same isolation, the same sense that their victories are hollow without genuine connection. But this struggle is not permanent. It's a passage through which those who choose authenticity must travel on their way to something more meaningful than mere success. The highest achievement is not winning the game as others have defined it, but creating your own game, setting your own rules and finding others who appreciate the courage it takes to live authentically in a world that rewards conformity. Your loneliness is temporary, but your authenticity is permanent. Choose wisely.